Welcome to this explainer. Man, I am absolutely thrilled to dive into this one with you today. We are going to get inside the head of a guy who is famous for, well, conquering the known world. But here's the thing. At his core, he was just as much a philosopher as he was a conqueror. We're exploring the dual philosophy of Alexander the Great. Let's get right into it.
Picture the scene. It's ancient Greece. Alexander the Great, literally the most powerful man on the planet, has just unified the Greeks and is days away from launching the greatest military campaign in human history. Surrounded by his generals, he seeks out a philosopher named Diogenes. Now Diogenes, he lived in a clay pot. I'm serious. He owned absolutely nothing, and he thought power and status were just pure illusions. So Alexander walks up to him and asks if he can do anything for him. Diogenes just squints up and says, "Yes, move, you're blocking my sun." His generals burst out laughing, right? But Alexander doesn't. He stands completely silent for a moment and then says, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes."
Now, that interaction isn't just some quirky historical footnote. It perfectly captures Alexander's lifelong internal war. On the one hand, you've got Alexander, a guy completely driven by limitless ambition, absolute power, and the literal conquest of the globe. And on the other hand, there's Diogenes, a guy with zero possessions who totally rejected status to find true, absolute freedom. Alexander actually spent his entire life caught right between these two extremes, this intense, outward drive to conquer everything in his path, versus a really deep philosophical craving to strip everything away down to what's fundamentally real. So to understand how this crazy dual philosophy even formed in the first place, we gotta rewind. Let's head back to 343 BC, to a quiet little sanctuary called Mysa. Alexander is just 13 years old, and his dad has just hired the absolute greatest philosopher of the ancient world to be his private tutor. Yep, Aristotle himself. For 3 whole years in this super serene environment, the future conqueror of the world wasn't studying warfare or battle tactics. He just sat and listened. He studied reason, ethics, literature, medicine, and science.
And Aristotle instilled in young Alexander a really profound framework for understanding the world, one that was heavily rooted in reason, or logos. But honestly, the most critical concepts he picked up was arete. Aristotle taught him that excellence isn't just some natural gift you're magically born with. No, it's a practice. It's a daily choice. It's a habit you literally wear right into your bones. Alexander learned super early on that a person's absolute highest calling was this disciplined, relentless exercise of the mind and will.
But, Aristotle also passed down a much darker, much more rigid worldview. He taught Alexander that humanity was strictly divided. In Aristotle's mind, Greeks were civilized, they were rational, they were capable of high philosophy. And everyone else, Persians, Egyptians, Indians, they were all deemed barbarians. Aristotle literally urged his star student to treat these non-Greeks like plants or beasts that just needed to be managed. Keep this dark philosophy in the back of your mind because Alexander's eventual realization about this becomes one of the most philosophically significant acts of the ancient world. Now, what's really fascinating here is that Aristotle also introduced Alexander to Homer's Iliad. And Alexander didn't just casually appreciate this book. He absorbed it with this almost religious devotion. To him, the Iliad wasn't a myth. It was a literal handbook for living. I mean, the guy slept with the text and a dagger tucked right under his pillow. He fiercely idolized the warrior Achilles, and he completely adopted Achilles' core philosophy, choosing a short, glorious life over a long, forgotten one. To Alexander, living a life without the stamp of true greatness, without glory, was basically just a slow death. And that brings us to a word that is absolutely crucial for understanding what drove him outward. The word is pothos. It doesn't translate super cleanly into English as just want or desire. It is way deeper than that. It's a limitless longing. It's this ache for the unnameable, a relentless, restless pull toward the horizon that doesn't just go away when you eat, sleep, or even when you win a huge battle. It was the absolute driving force behind his constant outward expansion. Just think about the biggest goal you've ever achieved. Now imagine that feeling of satisfaction just never arriving. That was pothos. So where exactly did this intense, almost overwhelming drive come from? Well, first off, his mother, Olympias, instilled in him this fiery conviction of divine destiny. She literally claimed he was descended from Achilles and even Zeus himself. Second, as we just talked about, the tragic, glorious model of Achilles in the Iliad gave him the ultimate template for greatness. And third, all of this combined into a deeply held belief that ordinary human categories simply couldn't contain him.
He genuinely, truly inhabited the belief that his life was meant for something vastly beyond the ordinary. You can see this fear of ordinary existence, this dread of being forgotten. It was incredibly palpable. When Alexander crossed into Asia at just 22 years old, the very first thing he did was sprint to the tomb of Achilles at Troy. He laid a wreath there and spoke his deepest fear out loud. He said, Achilles was fortunate to have had Homer to sing of his greatness. Think about that. Even at the very beginning of his massive, world-changing campaign, right in his moments of triumph, he was consumed by a genuine anxiety about whether anyone would actually remember him.
But let's be super clear about something. His pothos wasn't just blind, mindless conquest. It was a philosophy of exploration in action. Alexander didn't just want to conquer the world, he desperately wanted to understand it. As he marched across continents, he literally brought botanists, zoologists, and scientists along on his campaigns. He'd hold these intense, nightly philosophical debates right in his tent. And crucially, he showed deep, sincere respect for the Egyptian and Indian traditions he encountered along the way. He even wept with genuine grief at the death of a Persian queen. He was out there actively gathering wisdom from the exact same people his teacher Aristotle had completely dismissed. Through all of these incredible encounters across the globe, this totally new concept took root in Alexander's mind, homonoia. This translates roughly to concord, or global harmony. And it is so vital to recognize that for Alexander, this wasn't just some clever political trick to manage a massive new empire. No, it was a radical, genuine philosophical vision. He actually started to believe that true unity between vastly different peoples was possible. In an ancient world that was completely defined by strict borders and intense tribalism, this was an almost unimaginably progressive idea.
And this brilliantly illustrates just a massive, paradigm-breaking philosophical shift. We start with Aristotle's rigidly divided world, Greeks on one side, barbarians on the other. But Alexander shatters that boundary entirely. He moves toward this integrated unity where Macedonians and Persians are actually viewed as kinsmen. He looked at the honor of Persian nobles, the wisdom of Egyptian priests, the sharpness of Indian philosophers, and he basically decided unequivocally that his great teacher had been dead wrong.
Alexander actually put this vision of homonoia into practice through some incredibly bold and honestly highly unpopular steps. He started wearing Persian robes and adopting their court customs. He actively encouraged his top officers to marry Persian women, and he even recruited Persians into the absolute highest levels of his military. When his own Macedonian veterans furiously rebelled against this, they were livid, screaming that they hadn't marched to the ends of the earth just to become Persians, he did not back down. He actually executed dissenting Macedonians to protect his mixed court. The whole thing culminated in this amazing, famous speech at Opis in 324 BC, where he stood before his furious troops and called all of them, Macedonian and Persian alike, his kinsmen.
Section 2. A philosophy in motion. The contradictions of a conqueror. All right, we have to shift gears now to the darker, much more unresolved reality of his life. Because Alexander was definitely not some peaceful sage floating above it all. His philosophical ideals constantly collided with his violent temper and, frankly, the brutal realities of power. Just look at these insane paradoxes. He built these incredible cities of learning, right? But then he burned Persepolis and literally leveled the city of Thebes to the ground. He sought human brotherhood, yet in a drunken rage, he murdered his close friend Cletus with a spear, only to collapse into suicidal grief immediately after. He studied the Greek virtue of humility under Aristotle, yet he demanded divine honors from his subjects like a god. And when his closest companion, Hephaestion, died, his grief wasn't just sad, it was terribly, terribly destructive. He was a man fiercely at war with himself. And really, these contradictions completely define him. He was simultaneously the visionary, seeking deep knowledge, global unity, human connection, and the warlord, utilizing brutal military force, struggling with violent rage, and possessing this unyielding pride. The profound tragedy of his story is that while he deeply admired Diogenes' ability to want absolutely nothing, Alexander just couldn't stop wanting. He desperately sought a beautiful global harmony, but he wielded the most brutal military machine of his age to force it into existence. Let's move forward and see how this builds his final legacy. Alexander dies in Babylon in 323 BC. He's only 32 years old, and he had literally never once stopped moving. But his relentless push outward fundamentally reshaped human civilization. Greek becomes the common tongue of the Mediterranean. Alexandria emerges as this magnificent intellectual center.
The Hellenistic age he ushers in paves the way for entirely new philosophies like Stoicism and Epicureanism to take shape. The East and West synthesize in a way that ultimately feeds right into the very foundations of our modern world today.
As he lay on his deathbed, slipping away, he was asked who should inherit his massive, unprecedented empire. Now, the historical manuscripts actually disagree on what his exact final whisper was. Some say he said the strongest, while others translate it as the worthiest. And you know what? Maybe that ambiguity is perfectly fitting. Alexander spent his entire life exploring the space between philosophy and conquest, but he never fully resolved what worthiness truly meant. Was it brute strength? Was it wisdom? Was it the man standing there with the massive army? Or was it the man sitting quietly in the sun in a clay pot?
Which leaves us with this final thought, derived directly from his incredibly intense, boundary-pushing life. What if the boundaries we inherit, whether they're geographic, cultural, or even just the limits of our own minds, are not the truth of things? Alexander's life, with all its brilliant vision and its brutal flaws, really challenges us to question our own limitations. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning those boundaries, and I will see you next time.